I want to make reference to the most recent global risk report of the WF, and there we see, in fact, there is a picture for 2 years forward, World Economic Forum, and a picture 10 years forward. Now, what you do see is that in 10 years, the top 4 is all colored green. Now, if you compare the two, and you can take a deep dive into the report, it's easily available. But what is the highest climber, we could say, it's number 4. It's the element of biodiversity loss. And I think it's very important that we are aware of the fact that also as companies, our impact on ecosystems is an important one. We need to focus on that. We already have the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which focuses on scope 1 to 3 emissions. We now also have science-based targets for nature, where companies engage themselves also as individual firms to take a look at what about the ecosystems and our impact on ecosystems. And I see sometimes companies that are starting to have biodiversity and thinking about it as one of their KPIs. So that's a very important one also for the future to come, to go beyond just carbon emissions. To show you an example, I told you about target setting and the importance of it. This is an example of a company active in copper industry, which of course also has quite an important impact in the field of sustainability and also quite a number of interesting applications, by the way. What you do see here is a company that has set itself concrete targets on a number of elements, use of recycled metals, CO2 emissions. An interesting one is also CO2 emissions per ton of product. Do we do it relatively or do we do it absolutely? Because by 2050, zero emissions is an absolute target. So we also need to think very well about that one on a company level. So here you see a company setting itself targets towards 2024, also 2030. Now, a very interesting, amazing, but also complex route is, how do you come to these targets? It's a whole process. It's a process about measurement, but it's also a process about priority setting. And Annelies was talking about materiality, and that is in fact where to a large extent materiality comes in. To also show you the importance of those targets and where we are today, if we just take a look at the environmental side, and of course we do know, and we have lots of materials on the social and governance side. I'm going also to talk to you about the governance side of sustainability. But if you focus here on the environment, we see that a lot of companies are setting targets, and it's mainly on CO2 emissions. What you also do see here in this picture is that on other different elements related to the environment, like water consumption, pollution, biodiversity, I repeat it, this is much less prevalent. And I think that is also a very important challenge, because I'm asked to provide you with challenges. That's also a very important challenge for the future. Then coming to the next challenge. So the first one was the target setting. The next one is, what to do about consumer behavior, because of course, it's not the sole responsibility of business. We also have consumers, and a very interesting, very recent article in Harvard Business Review says, well, you can have sustainability via, in fact, consumer purchase, that consumer purchases more sustainable, more environmental and social friendly products, but you can also have a more active customer participation. Then you also can have either existing markets or new markets. I'm just going to provide you with a number of examples who speak for themselves. So if you focus on an existing market and existing purchase, there we have the example of Carlsberg with a new way of packaging. So rather than having the plastic folio around the six-pack, what they have developed is a sort of environmentally friendly glue that glues the cans, and then a very small plastic lid. So this is your existing consumers in an existing behavior, but making that product more environmentally friendly here in this respect. And of course, there are a number of other aspects, social aspects like alcohol abuse and so on. This company also needs to focus on, because those might be new markets. But this is an example, existing markets, sustainability via the purchase. If we take a look at companies entering new markets, there we have, for example, Schneider Electric, focusing on energy efficient services. So we know Schneider Electric from a large extent from the relays and the circuit breakers. What they are entering now is the market of making our houses more energy efficient by the use of technology, which then means saying to your consumer, well, follow me into that new market, because trust me, we are doing the right thing. So customers purchase, but the company helps the consumer going into a new market, which will have an important positive impact on the environmental footprint in this case. Then, of course, you can have something where the company actively asks the consumer to participate. For example, Nike's program on Made to Play. Nike came to the conclusion that little girls drop off sports after a number of years, much more comparable with boys, which is, of course, very unfortunate. They have developed some sort of program, Made to Play, focusing on keeping women and girls more active in sports. And they also have found, well, okay, it's not just about that one. It's also investing in innovation, new products, and so on to bring that to them. And last but not least, hybridizing means, well, you make your customers participate in new markets. For example, Vanish, and we know it's some sort of detergent. We use it in the washing. They first said, well, let's make our packaging and the product more eco-friendly. But in the end, they have seen, well, this is not enough. We want to enter new markets. If we really want to have an impact, we want to make clothing more sustainable also by the use of our product. So this is to show you and to disentangle to some extent how companies can impact consumer behavior. And we should not always take the easy road saying, well, but the consumer has to decide, has to do it. No, it's more, we need to help the consumer, at least to some extent. Last point after the target setting and impacting consumer behavior is also focusing on what you as a company are and want to be in the field of sustainability. So you see it there. Companies should really think about their ambition level in sustainability, and companies should care. And I think that's a very important challenge that the noses are in the same direction. To what extent do the people working in our organization have the same importance, put the same importance into environmental issues, social issues, and so on, which means that we also need to take that into account in our recruitment process. That's a very important one, because otherwise we will keep on having internal fights trying to convince people that we have to do it. And at this stage, we might have to do it, but in the long term, we really need to have noses much more in the same direction. What you also see there is that the governance of sustainability is an important one. And we are doing study work in that field. What you do see, of course, in some cases is that companies have a sustainability director or sustainability manager, but it needs to be much more. I just show you the example of Nestlé here, and the name of the company is not important, but just to show you how it is embedded at different levels. This company at the level of the board of directors has a sustainability committee that focuses on sustainability, composed by board members next to the nomination committee, the audit committee, and so on. And that's a tendency I see, and I think it might even be in need to really have knowledgeable board members in that field. At the level of the executive board, ESG is being set as a very important element, and there they have a number of external experts that feed the executive board. It's called the Creating Shared Value Council. So you have to give it a name, but it's a sort of external advisory body. But next to that, you need to bring it down in the organization. And there they have an ESG council. And the most important part here is they have identified 5 work streams, and each of these work streams has a team and a responsible working and a governance around it, working on it in order to make it safe that this all happens. And you see at the right-hand side also zones and market management. They also have to provide the data. So you see here just an example of a company showing you, of course, I would certainly not recommend just copy-paste, but we really need to think and we really need to embed that governance also in the company. I want to conclude with, I would call it sustainability a chain of change, yeah, because that is really a chain of change, and it's based on what I heard and what I hear in a number of business testimonials. So it first starts with doing it in the dark, and I'm going to come with some more information here. Doing it in the dark means raising the awareness. It also means having one-on-one talks with board members and top management in order to really feel where are they, what is their stance in sustainability, are we having the same ambition level, yes or no, and also daring to speak out what the sustainability challenge of the company is. That is work that also needs to be done. The second one is, well, to make people see the challenge and also to give sustainability a voice in your meetings. It should be put on the table. It's not in our DNA to always do that. We need to go through a phase, and then it's time for action. And that is where the topic of materiality comes in, which we also focus on in our Transforming to Sustainable Business program. That is where targets need to be set. That is where we come with action plans and governance. And you also see this is very important, but we need a road before that. And then, of course, we need to do it and dare to show the results. Dare to be proud of what you are doing, create visibility. And if you have gone through these phases and are doing it well, then sustainability will be truly embedded in what you are doing. So these are three challenges I wanted to bring to you: the target setting, the consumer behavior, and the sustainability governance. Of course, there's much more, but that is what we do also focus on in our research and our programs. Annelies.
Thank you, Xavier, for sharing this part on the challenges that are there. And I do recognize them because this is indeed something that we focus on in several of our programs. And before we continue with the focus on a climate policy, I would like to take a few minutes of your time to focus on what's the purpose and the goal of Vlerick Business School in this whole story. Live your dream, learn continuously, and leap with confidence is the purpose of Vlerick Business School. And if we transfer that to our sustainability portfolio, we really not only bring new programs to the market where we inspire people about this topic, but bringing it into action is definitely something that is part of our strategy. We want to support you with the tools, what has already been mentioned by Xavier, support you in bringing the change in your company, and therefore we do a lot of research with organizations, but we also have our sustainability portfolio that can support individuals there. Vlerick in numbers, we are a #1 top-ranked business school, triple accredited, so we are proud of that quality stamp, but we also support more than 5,000 executive professionals every year to go through an executive program. And we have international alumni across the world, more than 24,000 people, where we are also very proud of. But of course, I told you I would definitely link the story of Xavier towards our sustainability portfolio. And there you can see we have 4 main programs. First of all, if we take a look at the short-term programs, then we have our next program coming up, and was already mentioned, is our Transforming to Sustainable Business program. This is a 4-day program where we support people who have a sustainability challenge coming up. And it can be developing a sustainability strategy. It can be already a company that is more mature and has a strategy already a little bit more clear, but has several projects that will transform their business and who are looking for support and answers to deal with that. The next in line is our Director Climate Journey. And what was also mentioned is working on different levels in the organization is important to bring the sustainability story forward in every company. So therefore, this program focuses on board level and guides them throughout the climate challenges and how to deal with climate risks that are coming our way, but also how to find as an organization an answer to overcome certain challenges. And then the last program is Take the Lead in Sustainability Management, which will be organized again next spring, is an online journey. And like Xavier mentioned it already, we really want sustainability to be embedded in the whole company. So many individuals are involved. And this program supports people to bring more knowledge, to bring that first small step in their way of thinking and behaving. So Take the Lead in Sustainability Management has been supporting the past 2 years more than 600 individuals to improve their knowledge and their first actions in sustainability. Then, as a last program that we have in this program portfolio, we also have a brand new European MBA program, which offers it's an MBA journey, but with certain focus on sustainability when you meet at a different location. So this is a combination of an online journey that you go through with a few modules that you meet the whole group in Paris, in Copenhagen, but also moments that we will dive deeper into the subject of sustainability, like sustainability finance, but also what about purpose in your organization? What about sustainability operations? So these topics will be covered as well during the program when you meet your group at a nice location. Then another option, of course, if you feel you want to bring your company forward with a group of participants, then we have also a lot of companies that have already reached out to us to guide them in their sustainability exercises, developing the strategy, bringing the mindset to a higher level of a broad audience. So that is definitely also an option for many organizations. If there are any questions related to those programs that I just mentioned, please, these are my contact details. You can definitely reach out to me via email or via phone. And I think this brings us to the second part of this webinar, where I would like to give the floor to Professor Jos Delbeke. Maybe, Jos, if you can take over and share your slides, that would be great. I cannot see him now.
Okay, you see me now?
Yes, I do. Great.
Okay, and you see the slides as well or not?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, so thank you very much, Xavier and Annelies, and it will be my pleasure to entertain all of you for half an hour or so on the issue of climate change and on the Green Deal, in particular, what Europe is doing on this front. Now, I will...
Jos, can I interrupt for a minute? Yeah. You're not yet on presenter mode, so we see your whole screen now. Okay, maybe it's easier to... No.
No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
I think you go just to slideshow.
Yeah, to the tab of slideshow on top. No.
To the right, yes, yeah. Slideshow, yeah. And then okay. Yes, that's it.
That's better.
Okay, now we have it. Okay,
yes.
Sorry for this. Yes, I was confused. Yeah. Okay, well, I will distinguish two parts in my talk. It's going to be about the global context and European policy. And then we will zoom in on some practical instruments of climate policy, because as was mentioned by Xavier, there is a lot of importance to what companies are going to do in this space. And the European Union has been developing clearly a market-based approach. And that is where I would like to put a lot of emphasis on that. But just to start with the global context, climate change is a kind of environmental problem of the third generation, if I may say so, because it is not having an impact on human health. It is on the nature and on the globe as such. And the IPCC, which is the consensus of produced by scientists all over the globe, said that this is proven. The climate change is unprecedented in terms of decades, even millennia, and the human influence is very important. And the whole globe is going to be impacted. So they also said that we should limit our climate change to maximum 2 degrees Celsius, and if at all possible, to strive at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And some noise has been in the press because a very important report, the 6th environmental report from the IPCC, came on the table last week. Now, just to indicate, just to indicate how much we are talking over millennia, This is a slide where the point 0 is the Roman times. And you see climate change in the last 100 years, now going up with 1.2 degrees Celsius. And you see that the geological cycle is changing from the Holocene to uncovered territory. So it's not just about the weather of last year and the dry, temperatures and hot temperatures we have been seeing. This is something very fundamental that goes back to more than 22,000 years in history. Now, how does it happen? And that is a very important and disappointing graph that I'm showing to you, because it comes from CO2 emissions, the human influence. Industrial revolution started around 1750. Fossil fuels were being used, in particular coal, and then later oil and gas. And you see on this slide that the CO2 emissions seen over the last 2 centuries are going up and up and up. Despite all policies, it's still going up. Now, there is one point that is new, and that is that the International Energy Agency a couple of months ago said that possibly due to the war in Ukraine, we may see a peaking in this increase of CO2 emissions in the next 1 or 2 years, and that would be really good news for the climate. So how disastrous the war in Ukraine is, the impact on climate change, and I'm going to come back on that later on in my talk, may in the end be positive. But what you see also on the slide is that as of the 1960s, 70s, you saw an implicit leveling off of the old industrial world, the majority of emissions being made by Europe, by the United States, and by here and there an industrial nation. But then the red zone that you see on the final part and the last part of the slide is the showing the industrialization of Asia and China in particular. And there the emissions have been going up. And that is where the Kyoto Protocol, for example, that was adopted in the 1990s was completely out of date, because since the 1990s, we saw this spectacular development of emissions over the last 2 decades. Now, who is the largest emitter is the obvious question. And the daunting reply is that, that this emitter is China, and China emitting today 27% of CO2 emissions. You see that the United States is following with 11%, the EU 27 with 6.4%. Of course, China is a big country, and China has 1,300,000,000 inhabitants, so you have to make corrections for that. If we look at what is the essence of climate change, what kind of fossil fuels, and you see top of the ranking is still coal, followed by oil, followed by gas, and then all the rest. So if we are talking about climate policy, it is basically about how to reduce emissions related to the use of coal, oil, and gas. Now, some will say, and in particular, when we are at the climate negotiations, which is under the umbrella of the United Nations, the developing nations, such as Asia in particular, they refuse being pointed at as this major source of emissions, because they say there is a historical responsibility as well. We have to accumulate emissions since the start of the emissions of CO2, say Industrial Revolution 1750. And that is where this graph is showing that the majority of emissions come from the United States and Europe, and that the minor part comes from the developing world. And that colors the difficulty at the level of the United Nations, where deals have to be done, whether it is about the responsibility today, China the biggest emitter, for example, or and to what extent the historical emissions need to be incorporated into all this. Now, I mentioned the United Nations. We have today the Paris Agreement since 2015, and where we are today is that if we would not have any effort whatsoever, we would see by the end of the century that climate change would go up to close to 5 degrees warming compared to the pre-industrial times. Now, the scientists, just to recall, have said us we have to go to 1.5 to 2 degrees, which is the green line on the bottom, which is quite a span from where we are. And where we are today is somewhere in the orange zone, which is the current policies, where we are, according to pessimists, we are in the zone of 2.5, 2.9. But the IEA that I mentioned a few minutes ago is indicating that we may, with current policies, go below the 2 degrees Celsius if we continue what we are doing over the last couple of years. So the current policies show and indicate that the glass is half full, the glass is half empty, according to which vision that you are developing. But the important thing is that we get to a peaking of the emissions as soon as we can, because once we have reached a peak, we can discuss how to reduce. And a very important element I was indicating earlier, that the major emitter is China in terms of a nation. But if we look at the emissions per head, you see that the world is converging over time, and that since the 1970s, 80s, you see that the emissions per head in the old industrialized part of the world, say North America and Europe, is going down. And in the newly industrializing zones of the world, say Asia, South America, and to some extent Africa, are slightly going up. So we see over time a kind of convergence of the emissions of carbon dioxide per head. And I think that is perhaps and hopefully a tendency that is going to continue, in particular where the industrialized world is reducing its emissions significantly.
Jos, sorry to interrupt, but there's an interesting question. I'm only going to interrupt you when it's really related to one of the slides. Yep. Somebody in the audience is asking, well, and it's a very interesting question, do we have some sort of similar graph taking into account where the products go to? Because a lot of the products which are being made in China go to Europe and other countries. Is there any idea on that in order to make it even more relative?
Yeah, it is. There is an idea, as you are indicating. There is a lot of research going on. I think, roughly, to summarize what I deduct from the results of these studies, is that half of the emissions up to a half, may be attributed to a relocation of carbon-intensive industry, which is basically the import of steel, of cement, of chemicals, so hard to abate sectors as they are known. But the other half is basically much more energy and carbon efficient technology. Now, the jury is out, on this half-half. Some would say is a third, it's 2/3, either way. It's a debate, and which I will come back in a moment, which led to the Europeans, who have a high carbon price today, to say we need a tariff at the border just to equalize competitive competitive positions. But I'm coming to that in a moment. A relevant question that needs to be replied to, but supply chains are so difficult to disentangle, and that makes the whole story about what is net in this emissions per head so difficult to reply. So if I come back to the slides, and please interrupt me if you have questions, is the international climate strategy that Europe is currently developing. In fact, Europe says we need an effort by all countries. And that is exactly what the Paris Agreement is doing. And it builds on all the earlier sessions, but all countries are involved. In the Kyoto Protocol, there was action only from the developed countries, but that has now been changed to all countries. And Europe wants to take a leadership role into all this because of its historical climate responsibility, because it also finds a lot of economic opportunities in the new technologies that are being developed. And now resilience and autonomy has been added now that we are in a situation of war, where a lot of our carbon successes in the past were based on the import of cheap natural gas in the ranking of the fossil fuels. You have seen that coal was at the top, and then oil came, and then gas is relatively more efficient in terms of carbon emissions. So these three reasons make that Europe is developing a leadership role into all this. And you have heard the Green Deal. The Green Deal, that is the last commission, or the current commission, Ursula von der Leyen and the coalition in the European Parliament is steaming ahead for a massive and scaling up of low carbon investment. A lot of public resources are attributed to that, but basically it is a lot to do about energy, about renewable energy, about low carbon energy, about efficient use of energy, and into all this, the electrification of transport and heating. We see the electrification of the car park. We see the heat pumps coming up, which is an electrification of heating of buildings. And we see that in industry, in the so-called hard to abate sectors, in steel, in cement, in non-ferro and chemicals, that very important developments are currently taking place. So the Green Deal wants to scale these investments up. And the target of the EU is to have a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 of 55%, measured on 1990 levels, which is the historical United Nations baseline. And we want to do this without a loss in GDP. And I think so far we are on that journey. As you can see, the red line is steadily going down. We are approaching this 55%. It's fair to say that up to 1/3 still needs to be done in the remaining 8 years. But the red line is clearly on the decline, and we should accelerate our actions in order to get there. By 2050, Europe wants to be climate neutral, and you see how daunting that journey, the red line, is for the European Union. So how are we going to approach these targets, which are quite ambitious? And that's the second part of my talk, the climate policy tools. In fact, there is a lot of emphasis in Europe on market-based instruments, in particular for the manufacturing industry, the energy sector, and intra-EU aviation through a price on carbon. I come to that in a minute, but there are also other instruments like renewables. There was a big deal, overnight reached over the last 24 hours. There is efforts on energy efficiency, on a raft of issues on cars. You may have followed in the press the recent discussion between the German government, coming back on an earlier word to phase out car emissions by 2035. So there is a raft of instruments that are currently being developed, but I would like to emphasize 5 of them. And in particular, I would like to go into the market-based approach. And that is the EU ETS, the Emissions Trading System, which is in fact an old idea of economists. Mr. Nordhaus, Bill Nordhaus, was winning the Nobel Prize with that in 2018, and saying if carbon emissions are free, nobody cares. So we need to have a price on carbon, and you can do that through carbon taxation, something we tried in the European Union, and we did not succeed. And then we created a carbon market, and that is where we currently are, an emissions trading system in which some 10,000 installations, in fact, all big installations in industry are covered. And we are close to a half of Europe's CO2 emissions. And basically, these installations are in power generation, in manufacturing, and in intra-EU aviation. And under that system that started in 2005, the emissions have been reduced by 43%. Now, a very important element on the market is a market price. And today we have a historical development, that is that the market price that started in 2008 at around 25 euros per ton has today reached the 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. Today, the market price is around 92, 93. So there is a market, there is a supply and demand for allowances. And that comes from the fact that for every single industrial installation in Europe, there is a reduction of emissions that is collectively imposed, and that reduction of emission makes that the allowances, so the certificates that give you the permission to emit a ton of carbon dioxide, is getting very scarce. And so I said, the total amount of emissions went down with 43% based on 2005. The target for 2030 is 62%. So we will see that this system is going to become even more tighter over the future. And the flip side of having this market where the certificates are auctioned on a market, by the way, this is the EEX in Leipzig that is managing the auctioning platform. The amount of revenues is also going up quite significantly. And a lot of these revenues are used to kickstart investments that are particularly attractive in terms of low carbon emissions. The Innovation Fund, in which, for example, at the Port of Antwerp, just to indicate, where is a network of carbon dioxide is being installed, a quite significant support has been given from the Innovation Fund that is collecting some part of the funds that are raised through the auctioning of these certificates. Now, we recently went through a review of this ETS, and the ambition, the emission reduction factor that is imposed every year is being increased from 2.2% to 4.4% per year. So that means that the total amount of emissions goes down every year as of next year with 4.3%, and as of 2028 with 4.4% every year. So that makes the amount of available allowances scarcer and scarcer. And so the 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide that we are currently reaching is having an impact on industry. And one concern is carbon leakage, or put it in economic terms, the loss of competitiveness that may be caused through the putting a price on carbon. And that is where a tariff at the border, a carbon tax is being raised at the border under the name a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a CBAM. And that is going to be installed as of October this year in a partial run, but as of 2026, there is going to be payments when, say, an exporter of steel from India or China is importing steel into the EU. There is going to be a carbon price that needs to be paid on top of the regular price that is being paid for that ton of steel or cement or electricity that is going to be imported. So this carbon border adjustment mechanism, this tariff at the border, is provoking quite some interest and quite some animosity. You know, the United States is going into the Inflation Reduction Act, so they take quite a different route to carbon reduction, and that is going to provoke quite some debates. On other issues, the carbon market signal is being widened also to transport and heating and maritime sector. So the system is being used increasingly, and I will stop my comments there on the ETS in order to spare out some time for questions. Sustainable finance is another one that is reinforcing the market approach of the EU. The taxonomy, many of you have been following that for sure. There is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and the Corporate Social Reporting Directive that are kicking in, as of next year. And that is leading to a lot of information on the climate risks that companies are undergoing, and also on the risks that they may impose on climate. So there is a dual connotation there. Renewable energy, as I said overnight, a target was agreed of 42.5% by 2030. This is quite a significant increase, but it's taking shape, and it's taking shape much faster compared to what we thought. Energy efficiency, renovation of buildings in particular, but also use of heat pumps in industry is going to become very important. And then for all the rest of the emissions that are not mentioned by our companies, there is a delegation made to the member states. And so every member state, and they are all lined up here, they have a differentiated target. The richer you are, the more you have to reduce your emissions. And if you look at the targets that are there, they are quite significant. Finally, a word on the war in Ukraine. You know, it's very remarkable how the EU ETS has been resilient against the impacts and the turmoil on the energy crisis. And I think Politico was naming Mr. Putin as the champion of 2022 for accelerating the climate and energy transition. And indeed, what we see is that investments in renewables, energy efficiency, infrastructure is going through the roof. And it is not more than a couple of weeks ago that The Economist was saying and writing in its head article that the energy transition is presumably being accelerated with 5 to 10 years because of as a side effect of the war in Ukraine and high energy prices. So I come to my conclusions. We are not yet there. You know, let's realize that global emissions are still rising, but the EU is developing a Green Deal that is quite a comprehensive investment program and takes a market approach, putting a price on carbon. But not only that, there is a raft of issues that are being related to that, and the EU ETS raises a lot of fresh revenue on that. On the Repower EU investments, for example, some 20 billion has been taken out and has been raised through the EU ETS. So through that, you know, there is some hope that we are going to get there, but it's a journey that is going to provoke a lot of change, in particular in the company sector and the investment patterns that we are going to see in the coming years. In fact, they are already taking shape and taking, reality as we observe the statistics, not least from the International Energy Agency. So over to you, Xavier and Annelies.
Thank you, Jos, for a very nice overview, very concise overview, perfectly in time, so that provides us with some time for Q&A. I took a look at the chat box, and yes, we have some interesting questions which are being put forward. First one, Jos, is what is the answer by the EU towards the Inflation Reduction Act of Biden? We know that that has been also in the media and in the news a couple of times. Can you give us an overview on that?
Yes, well, there is a lot of things going on, but last week, the European Commission was developing an investment and industrial package to lead us to the low carbon transition from the manufacturing industry, and that is meant to be a reply to the Inflation Reduction Act. There is one thing, however, it cannot be denied that the Inflation Reduction Act is very protectionist. You know, there has a lot of local content, you know, provisions in it, and that is being debated with the European Commission, you know, as we speak. And secondly, there is a lot and a very strong subsidization. The tax credits are very important under the Inflation Reduction Act, while the EU is putting a price on carbon. So, you know, there is a span there that is not going to be disappear overnight, if only because the energy price reality is so different in the United States. Gas is widely available and cheap. For us, gas is almost not available, following the war in Ukraine. And to the extent we have access to gas, the LNG is expensive gas. So that reality remains there. And I think the last word has not yet been said on this.
Okay, thank you very much. Then another question. Well, we have seen, I think the EU was responsible for something like 7% of the CO2 emissions. The question came is, well, what will be the impact of the Fit for 55 goals if the others are not that ambitious as we are? I would not call this that goes into the kindergarten logic, but I think it's very important to know what will be the impact of Europe in the global world then?
I would like to reverse that question, and that is what I observe is that there is a technology competition ongoing on low carbon technology. That is what we see in the IRA in the United States, but that is also what we see in China. For example, high-speed trains, or the battery development, or the electric vehicle, or the renewable energy. These are all sectors in which China has the leadership. So I would rather reverse, let's make sure we are at the top of that technological race. And that is what we are doing. If I observe in the steel sector, what ArcelorMittal is doing in the port of Ghent, for example, is a world-class authority top. What other companies are doing in the field of renewables, the windmills offshore, that Europe is developing all over the world, is top. So if we are at the top of the race, we are going to have economic opportunity, and that's what we are already seeing.
And we have seen in the past that we lost some momentum with the battery technology, which went to China. So here you're saying and you stress that, and it was also mentioned in the chat box, there are economic opportunities with it, the whole idea of circular economics. So let's not doubt, let's really go forward, move fast forward. Then another question was related to methodologies for measurement, as somebody was asking here. So how trustful are the methodologies to estimate the historical emissions? Because of course now the methods are there. You have shown us what happened since the past. Are these really estimations, or since which year are they really okay?
Yeah, well, there are, of course, a lot of estimations. That's true. But these estimations have been put into an international framework. And I would say that's the hidden part of the negotiations at the level of the United Nations. What was done under the Framework Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and now the Paris Agreement is a kind of common set of rules about how to estimate the emissions that are there. So we have a kind of framework that has been agreed. And on top of that, new technologies are developing. For example, space observation is very important when it comes to, the tracking of what is happening in the rainforests all over the globe, not only in Brazil, but in Central Africa or in parts of Asia. So there are new technologies coming up, but there are good conventions that have been agreed worldwide at the level of the United Nations. So there is going to be a mistake, but we can be pretty, sure that the margin of mistake is going to be constant over time.
Okay, thank you. Then another one is about the supply chain. Yes, we see that in some cases, and I from time to time do a questionnaire with companies, and what always strikes me is that the responsibility in the supply chain is a little bit behind. So companies tend to focus first on what they do themselves, and maybe that's not a bad thing, but some companies also have an important foot in their supply chain. Now, what I have seen, for example, is that some companies really actively engage with their suppliers, so that they really sit together with the suppliers and say, for example, we expect from you that you will use X% of renewable energy, or like AstraZeneca is doing, they are asking 95% of their suppliers to be aligned with the science-based targets. So which really puts the bar quite high. So, but I think that there, rather than just imposing it, it's better to really go into partnership to learn from each other. But here the point again is on measurement. Is there some solid methodology to take a look at emissions in your supply chain? How you do that?
That's a very good question. And normally we have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. That's what is being done. Scope 1 is what comes through your chimney. If you have a blast furnace, what comes to is released into the atmosphere. The scope 2 is electricity use. And scope 3 is all the rest, including transport and the rest of the supply chain. And that is where we hope that through this disclosure of information that is going to become mandatory, a lot of information is going to come on the table, and we will be learning by doing. You know, all these climate policies, like the carbon market as well, let's face it, like the journey on the renewables, this was a very intensive learning by doing exercise. We learned the job by doing it, but it took us 1 decade, 2 decades to learn it. And so through this disclosure regulation, I think in not more than half a decade, we will have a wealth of new information on scope 3. And that is exactly what you are pointing out, the other elements of the value chain.
Okay, thanks. Jos, a very last question and a very brief one from my part is, well, we talk a lot about what companies should do. Is there anything, in your opinion, which they should not do?
Wow, that's a good question. I think 3 elements. You know, it always comes down to the use of fossil fuels. So having a look at how to minimize energy use. And a lot of that is, as you were mentioning as well, is the circular economy, is recycling. And what they also could do is through those inputs about, you know, how to reduce fossil energy and how to recycle, to involve their customers. And I think that is where companies can do a great job. And what they should do is go beyond the legal obligations. You know, legal obligations are very important. You know, they put the bottom line, but there is a lot more that can be done. And I think that the public is expecting that from companies, that they are engaging into that.
So if you just follow the law, you're not going to reap any concrete benefits nor strategic benefits from that. Okay, so Jos, thank you very much. I would like to conclude with some elements. Well, we see, I think, the importance of technology, the importance of developments in technology. We see that there are a lot of examples coming up, a very interesting one on climate tech, also startups, even in this field. I think it's amazing. If you follow what is coming out there, what is going to come in the next couple of years, it will be really amazing. You also mentioned rightfully the importance of measurement, and I think there also a lot of things are coming to us. For example, the IFRS, the financial reporting standards, well, they are also changing and embracing sustainability. So a lot is going to come there, which will make it even much easier to compare companies' performance, not only financially, but also in the field of sustainability. And 2 brief last points, of course. We have been focusing here on the environmental dimension. And of course, we all agree that this is an extremely important one. But we do not forget that in sustainability, we also have an important social dimension related to human rights, well-being, and so on and so forth, which is, by the way, also how we see it at Vlerick. But in this time frame, of course, we had to focus, and we are very happy that we focus also on the environmental side. And last but not least, again, SDG number 17, partnership for the goals. We cannot do this alone. We cannot do this in the classical value chains and so on. We really need partnerships. And I see companies today that really actively search, because the solutions might come from countries, from counters, from suppliers and so on, where we did not yet know it. So thank you very much. I think we are perfectly in time. Jos, it was a great pleasure having you with us. Thanks, Annelies, for also guiding us, presenting what we do at Vlerick. So I hope you found it useful, and hope to see you back one day here, maybe in one of our campuses, an online program, and so on. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.